Hey there, welcome. Welcome to the PCA Sim Racing Chat Talk or Chalk Talk. That's what it is. It's a Chalk Talk, and I'm going to be talking about chalk tonight. No, seriously, I'll be talking about car setup and things. And we just usually when I do these, I just kind of wait a few moments, seconds, moments, whatever you want to time, however you want to time this, and let everyone to sign in. So I see Anchor's already done that. If you don't mind, just in the chat box over there, just kind of say a hello, a hi, whatever you want us to do. And I kind of just keep an eye on that to see how many people are actually logging in here. And I'll keep an eye on this. And okay, so couple more minutes or a minute or so here, and then we'll just we'll get going here. So I'm assuming that many of you are in the Northeast because of, well, actually, no, that's not true. Well, but a lot of the people that this went out to were part of the Zone 1 sim racing league, I guess. And I know a lot of those people are in the Northeast, but not necessarily. I hope the weather is nicer there than it is in the Northwest at the moment, where it seems like every day in the past 4 days I've been shoveling snow, which is just totally unusual for us here. So anyways, yeah, so let's get going here. And oh, great. Enrico is from Seattle. Yeah. Welcome to the shoveling snow scene out here. So so what we're going to do here is I'm going to cover some information about car setup. And as we go through this, if you have questions, you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a chat box and a Q&A only. If you have a question, it would be a whole lot easier if you put it into the Q&A only section. If you want to just chat and you want to comment or whatever, you can put it in the chat and you can say hello to whoever. But it's a whole lot easier for us. I have my lovely assistant, Robin, my wife, assisting me as always when I do these Chalk Talks, and she will be keeping track of your questions as we go along. If it's a question, where I've talked about something and you're unclear about it and you want some clarification on it before we go forward, put it in there and Robin will hand that to me or give me a note to cover that right then and there. But if it's a question that can wait until the end, I'm going to try to get through the content and then we'll go to a general Q&A session at that point. So if it's a general kind of question, we'll leave it to the end. If it's something that needs to be clarified right now, we will cover that right then. So like I said, this Chalk Talk is, for me, it's a lot of fun. I started the Sim Racer Academy, simraceracademy.com, a couple of months ago, and it has been an absolute blast. It's something that I've been involved with. I actually started sim racing and being involved with sim racing and stuff almost 20 years ago, way back. I was a beta tester on iRacing way back when it first began. I've sort of dabbled in it. And now taking what I've learned from coaching other drivers in real world racing and applying it to sim racing has been a blast. And I got to say, I've watched a couple of the sim racing events for the Zone 1 PCA Sim Racing League. And I've watched a few of those events now, actually. And man, it is brilliant racing. The coverage is brilliant. And it's really good racing. It's tough. It's competitive. It's really fun to watch. So I hope to do more of that because I'm going to be helping sponsor that league at some point here, and we're getting all that set up right now as we're going into the new year. One other thing that I'd like to suggest is I'm hoping that somewhere near you have a pen and a piece of paper and or a digital instrument that you can take some notes on, because I'm going to go through some information pretty quickly, and it would be best if you could just make some notes as we go along. That's probably going to help you when we get to the Q&A session as well. I'm not going to use any canned PowerPoint slides because these chalk talks are a lot more fun when I can be a little more free flowing. And if somebody has a question, I can kind of veer off rather than going, oh, well, that's slide 12. You know, I got to move ahead here. So, so I'm just going to talk through some things. I may demonstrate or illustrate some things on the board here if I need to. And with that, I'm just going to jump in here and start going. Great. Pen and paper ready. Awesome. Yes. Okay. Welcome to join the Pacific Northwest Zone. My problem with I only have one problem with sim racing. I don't have enough time for it. With my coaching schedule of travel and everything else, I never seem to be in one place long enough to actually do enough of it. So, but it's brilliant stuff, and we'll be on practicing a little bit tomorrow morning, though. I know that. Okay. So I'm going to cover two main kind of topics or areas around the whole topic of car setup. And but before I go there, I always joke about these things because often I get an email from somebody who sends me an email and says, you know, I'm driving and I always joke about this, you know, I'm driving an Excalibur GT4 plus 1.12 with 12-inch rear discs on 24-inch calipers on the front with a 2.4 millimeter front bar and a 12-inch rear wing and Recaro seats with, and it goes on and on and on. And it says, what tire pressure should I run? And I'm like, who knows? So there is the one thing about car setup is it's not like I can come along and nobody can actually just come along and say, here's the right setup for you. And my goal tonight is to help you understand two things. First, how to identify what your car needs. And then secondly, what it is you need to do to help it do that. And, you know, one of the great things about sim racing is you can just go online and you can buy somebody else's setup. But I've experienced it, and I've talked to enough other sim racers who have bolted on somebody else's setup on their sim car and went and driven it and went, this doesn't feel right to me. And it may not be right for you because you drive in a different way than the person that created that setup. So my goal tonight is to help you, whether you take that setup and then modify and tune from there, or take a standard iRacing or a Assetto Corsa or whatever platform you're using, use that setup in your car and then tune from there. My goal is to help you tune your car, to help you get your car tuned for you. So the how thing, and I'm gonna this is something that I am gonna write down here, is to me the biggest thing is there's a process you should go through every single time you finish driving. And you go through this process and the very first thing you ask yourself is what is car doing? What is car doing? Okay. And, at that point, you may come back and say, okay, the car is, let's say it's understeering. Okay. So then you go to number 2 and you go, where? And specifically, what corner? Okay. So then let's say it's understeering in turn 3. And then you go, where in corner? And in this case, let's say it's, it could be corner entry, it could be the middle of the corner, or it could be corner exit. And let's just say for here, we'll just say it is corner entry. So now we've identified that it's the understeer problem is not just, well, the car understeers. So what am I going to do to fix that? Well, there are 67.12 different things that you can do to fix understeer everywhere. But the more we can narrow it down, the easier it's going to be to fix the problem that you want to fix the most. And I know that, at some point you might go, well, the car's understeering. Where? Well, everywhere, every corner. Okay. Pick one corner. Pick the corner where it is having the biggest negative impact on your driving, and narrow it down. And, this requires a little bit of thought and going, okay, well, is it turn 3? Is it turn 1? Is it turn 5? Figure out exactly which corner it is that you're having the biggest problem with. And then you then dig into where in that corner. In this case, we're saying it's in the corner entry. Let's just say that. The next thing is, and this is critical. What am I doing? What am I doing as a driver at that moment in time? When the understeer begins, am I hard on the brakes? Am I starting to trail off the brakes or ease off the brakes? Am I turning the steering wheel? Have I already turned the steering wheel in? Have I come off the brakes and now I'm in between braking and throttle? Or am I starting to pick up the throttle? Am I starting to really squeeze on the throttle? Am I still tightening the wheel? Am I holding the steering wheel static in one position? Or am I starting to unwind the steering wheel? What am I doing at that moment in time when the understeer begins? And this may be the most important question, because if you can define that, that really, really helps you narrow down what it is that you're going to want to change in your car. Okay. And obviously we're going to get into those changes, but you can't fix something unless you know what to fix. So the very first part is figuring this piece out. So what am I doing when the car does that? Okay. Then as a follow-up question, and this is just kind of a gut level kind of thing. Is it me or car? So you just kind of this is one of those things that you quietly do with yourself, and you just quietly ask yourself, am I causing this problem, or is the car causing the problem? Is the car understeering, or am I making the car understeer? And you could make the car understeer by just being too aggressive or abrupt with the steering wheel. You could be popping your foot off the brake pedal. You could be doing all these different things that could be causing it. And if you are honest with yourself and you really ask yourself that question of is it me or the car, then you can start to figure out, well, should I actually be fixing the car setup, or should I just be working on my driving technique? Okay, so that's important. And then so you go through that process, and at the end of that, that's going to help you really narrow down what it is you're going to want to work on with the car setup. And if you just work through that, even that is going to help you a lot. But there's a bonus question, because there's always a bonus question, right? And the bonus is, one thing. If I could have the car do one thing better, what would it be? And I got to tell you that that question is used at the highest levels of motorsport. When I'm coaching drivers in IMSA, when I work with drivers in IndyCar, when I've heard debriefs in F1, that question gets asked a lot. If you could only fix one thing, what would it be? And that really helps you, again, kind of narrow it down into what it is that you really, really want to focus on. And a lot of times, especially, if you're in a situation where, you don't have a lot of time to make a change, you could be sitting going, well, I've got understeer in turn 3, but the car is loose. It's oversteering in turn 5. And I wish the car didn't feel so nervous on entry into turn 12 or something like that. You could have like 3 or 4 different things here. But when you then come back into at the very end and just say, what is the one thing? If I could only have the car do one thing better, what is the one thing that is stopping me from driving faster? Then that really helps you narrow it down. And again, once you narrow that down, it does become a whole lot easier to fix. Okay. And Ed asked the question, what's the most effective way to determine the right car setup when you have a team of 2, 3, 4 drivers? Ed, I'm trying to decide, because this could be a lengthy kind of a conversation. I'm just trying to think of whether to leave that towards the end here. Well, okay, so let me cover at this point to cover through this process, because this debrief process is absolutely critical. If all the team drivers, all 2, 3, 4 of the drivers, go through that exact same process and really take the time to go through that process. And hey, it'd be great if at the very end, all of you agree. I want to fix the understeer in turn 3. Okay, great. That makes it real easy. I think one of the things that you're asking here is then how do you prioritize if one driver says the understeer in turn 3, another driver says the oversteer in turn 5, and the other driver says that nervous entry in turn 12? How do you prioritize that? If you're using data, you can figure that out. I mean, you can just look at which part of that is having the biggest negative impact on your lap times. So that's one way of doing it. The second part is sometimes when you're trying to prioritize what to work on, it's not so much just what is going to lead to the faster lap time, but sometimes it's what am I going to feel more comfortable with? And in this case of having 2, 3, 4 drivers, it may be what are we going to feel most comfortable with? There are times where you can make a change to a car and make it handle better and therefore drive faster, but it becomes a little nervous for some drivers. It's difficult to drive. And that's one of those things where one driver has to compromise to help one or more of the other drivers. And I will say that comfort and confidence 9 times out of 10 beats the ultimate fastest setup. You may have a setup that for 1, 2, 3, 4 laps, you can drive it and it might be a couple of tenths quicker, but it's on the edge, so much on the edge that you cannot drive it consistently. You might make more mistakes. And other drivers are having more difficulty with it. I would then take a setup that is more comfortable and more consistent. So, Ed, I guess to answer your question, one is do that. All the drivers do this debrief process. Secondly, if there's no consensus, try to figure out what's going to have the biggest impact on making a change. And then the last part is go for comfort and consistency and confidence over ultimate lap time. Okay, so pretty simple, right? But that's the how of the figuring out what it is that you need your car to do. So that's the first step. Let's now get into the what. I mean, what we can change and what we can and how we go about doing that even. I'm just going to go through some principles, and there's some principles that I've written down here, and they're kind of things that I constantly go back to. And there are certain principles that if you asked most race engineers, they would all say some version of these things. And these are ones where I'm hoping you're going to take notes, because guess what number 1 is? Take notes. So the very first thing is take notes, because if you make some changes to the setup in your car and then afterwards you're going, which one was it? Was it that third adjustment that I made to the setup that was better, or was it the fourth one? And what was that one? It's very easy to get lost. So, and the great thing about iRacing or a set of course or something like that, you can always just kind of go back and reload your original setup and you're starting from the baseline again. But you may have found some things along the way that helped you, that helped a lot with that. So most important is take notes. The general rule, and this is a rule that's been around for car setup since the very first car was ever made, I think, but it's make one change at a time. If we're going with our understeer in turn 3, and I go, well, okay, we could soften the front springs, we could soften the front anti-roll bar, we could add more aero on the front, or take some rear wing out of it. We could put more rake in it, so lower the front of the car. We could change the tire pressures. We could add more camber or take some camber out. We could do all those things. And if you did all of them at the same time and then the car was better, which one was it that fixed it? Even 2 changes, we could soften the front springs and soften the front compression on the dampers, the shocks. And if we did that, if we did those two changes and it made it better, which one was it that made it better? If it didn't make any change, you could find out later on that one of them actually helped and the other one hurt. Or if the car got worse, again, you don't know which one it was. So make one change at a time. And you know, in the real world racing situation, sometimes we're tempted to do more than one change, and the reason is because changes can take a lot of time. Great thing about sim racing is it's really quick to make a change. So one change at a time. Make big enough changes that you can notice it. I see drivers often, you know, they'll change a tire, they'll change the front tire pressures half a psi or 1 psi, and they go out there and they go, I don't know if that's any better or not. Change the tire pressures by 4 psi. Like, make a big change, because in the beginning, you know, if we're working on this understeer in turn 3 situation, what you're trying to do is find a direction. That's really what your goal is just to find a direction and go, okay, we went up with the tire pressures 4 psi and car felt more responsive, but I felt like I lost some grip later in the corner. Okay, you can work with that. You can go, okay, well, maybe I've gone too far. Then you can start to bring it back down. But make big enough changes. And even, you know, if you've got spring rates that, you know, are maybe 50-pound increments or something, don't be afraid to make bigger changes and then come back rather than tiny little changes. Work on the end of the car that needs the work to be fixed. It needs to be fixed. In the case of understeer, in the entry of a corner, ideally you want to work on the front of the car. You want to work at giving the front more grip rather than taking grip away from the rear. Having said that, there comes a point in time where you may end up having to do that. If you've made every possible change you could make and you cannot get the front to gain grip. One of my other points here, the next point, is balance is more important than outright grip. So there comes a point in time where rather than giving the front end more grip, you might actually want to take a little bit of grip away from the rear of the car to get the car to turn more, because 9 times out of 10, this is not a rule, it doesn't work 100% of the time, but it works more often than it doesn't work. 9 times out of 10 or 8 times more often than not, you will be able to drive the car better, faster, if the car is balanced, if there isn't a big understeer in the car, even if it's got a little bit less overall grip. But absolutely start by trying to get the end of the car that needs the improvement, the fix. Try to fix it first. Like I said, balance is more important than overall grip. Again, by the way, none of these are rules. They don't work 100% of the time, but they work way more often than they don't work. Do ABA tests. So every now and then, if you're testing a change in their setup, and let's say that you've tried, you've softened the front springs in the car, and then you go out and you drive and you go, wow, okay, that's better, that's better, that's better. It's really important to then, so that's gone from A, the initial baseline, to B, the softer springs. It's important to go back to A again, go back to the original springs. And again, with a sim, those changes can be made so quickly that you should be doing this, because sometimes in the process, you learn how to adapt and how to drive it better. And you may end up finding that you go from the baseline, you go to the softer springs. Oh, I went 2 or 3 tenths quicker. And then you go back to the baseline again. You go, wow, I just went another tenth quicker, because it's your driving that's improving. So it's important to do ABA tests as often as you possibly can. Do sweeps. And by sweeps, what I mean here is, this is ideally in a practice session where you've got a little bit of time, but let's say you've got an anti-roll bar on the front of the car that you're at the medium setting. Well, go full stiff and then go full soft and just try it, because you don't know what that's going to feel like. But if you practice and you're going, hey, every time that I go full soft, you know, the car does have a little bit more grip, but it feels a little bit lazier. Okay, good information to know. I went full stiff. car does feel more responsive, but I feel like I lose some grip in the middle of the corner. Good information to have. So doing sweeps like that with the anti-roll bar, going from full soft, the softest springs to the stiffest springs, going from, you know, the highest ride height you would run to the lowest ride height, going up and down, and more rake and less rake. And, you know, same thing with the dampers, going from full stiff to full soft in all the settings that you've got with your car. And I know that, you know, some cars you have very few settings or changes you can make, but some you have lots of them, and you can get totally lost if you haven't paid attention to and made those notes along the way. So David asked this, and actually let me finish going through my guidelines here first. Okay. Do the sweeps. And then this is a like duh, and it is avoid preconceived ideas. And as an example, a preconceived idea is most cars, to gain grip in the front, you would soften the front springs or anti-roll bar or dampers. Okay. Because you want to have less load transfer. And I know a lot of people kind of go, well, isn't it going to cause the car to roll more and that have more load transfer? Actually, it is going to cause the front of the car to roll more, but that's not transferring as much load. In fact, a go-kart with no springs, that transfers all the load out into that outside tire. So in most situations, in most cars, if you soften the end of the car that needs more grip, because that ends up causing less load transfer, keeping the weight balanced over both the outside and the inside tire, which gives the front more grip. Or if you soften the rear, it'd be the rear. But that doesn't work all the time. And particularly where it doesn't work is, first of all, you can get too soft. And that's actually one of the questions you could go further with. All these things they're questions you can go deeper and deeper, but sometimes you can actually go so soft that the car feels so lazy that it actually is slower. Okay. But some cars, and particularly cars that have a lot of aerodynamic downforce, particularly cars that have aero downforce developed from the underside of the car. And, you know, currently I coach a driver racing in IMSA in an LMP2 car. Prototype car generates a ton of downforce from the air flowing underneath the car. The splitter on the very front of the car is super critical, the clearance between it and the ground. And if it does this, it loses grip. And therefore, sometimes to gain more front grip, we stiffen the front suspension to try to keep the platform of the car flatter, and therefore it generates more aerodynamic downforce. It may actually lose some mechanical grip from the suspension, but that's overpowered by the increase in aero grip. So that's where a situation of avoid preconceived ideas. If you've been told that, well, soften the end of the car that needs more grip, that works more times than it doesn't, but it doesn't work all the time. Copying an adjustment or a setup from somebody else doesn't necessarily work for you. I talked about that earlier. You can get setups for your cars, and sometimes they work for you and sometimes they don't. So, and one of the things that, one of the things that's really popular is in a bad way is somebody saying, well, hey, that car is they're running 1,000 pounds per foot per inch front springs on their car. I'm going to put 1,000 pounds springs on the front of my car too. Well, unless every other setup adjustment in your car is identical to that other car and the other car is identical to yours, it's not going to work necessarily. So don't just go, well, they're running those springs, so I'm going to run them as well. Don't just copy for the sake of copying. Learning what doesn't work is just as important as learning what does work. And this is one of those things that when I go coaching a driver, when we're going testing at a real track, and the driver tries some things and the engineer's trying some things and they work through some things and some of them don't work and the driver can get frustrated. And it's one of those things that I got to remind the driver, we're learning here, and understanding what doesn't work just made us smarter about what not to do next time. So just don't get frustrated if something doesn't work. And the very last thing on the guidelines is understand why. So if you know, in the case of put stiffer front springs in the car and we gain more front grip, we could just go, well, okay, let's put stiffer front springs in all the time. No, you have to understand that. And when you understand and start to really ask some questions and think about what's going on, you start to understand that oh, it's that aerodynamic downforce. Yeah, okay. So understanding the why behind changes, making a change that actually improves the car, but not knowing why it improved the car is almost as bad as making a change that doesn't work. So do everything you possibly can to understand why. And I understand that you are not necessarily professional race engineers doing this. So there's a limit. There's a limit here. But the more that you can understand, the more you start to read some things and listen to some people and get some further knowledge, the better you're going to get at tuning your car. Okay, so those are sort of the guidelines. Let me go back to David's question. David had asked, how many laps is enough to figure out what the setting change you made can be realized? The answer is yes. Sorry, it depends. There is no, well, it's always 2 laps or it's 5 laps or it's 8 laps. For sure, you've got to make sure that the tires are up to temperature and up to pressure. So you can, you may be able to go out there and in 2 laps, you start to go, well, I can feel the car, the understeer is gone. But if you do more laps and the tire pressures come up more, that understeer may come back again. So there is no, David, I'm sorry, but there's no like, oh, it's 1 lap, it's 12 laps, it's whatever. Part of that, a big part of that depends on how quickly you get up to speed and how quickly you're able to push the car to its limits to show its weakness. And by the way, going back to this, if you ever get to the point where you go, what is the car doing? You go, nothing. It's perfectly balanced. It's neutral. You probably are not pushing the car, driving the car hard enough, fast enough to have the car show its weakness. So, David, to answer your question, you've got to drive enough laps to the point where you've realized, oh, that's the weakness. And that weakness may have changed. It may not have changed, or it may have even gotten worse. So for sure, make sure that the tire pressures and temps have gotten up to where they need to be. That's the most important thing. And that you're driving the car, if your best lap is 1:30, if you're doing 1:32, unless the car has become really bad, if you're 2 seconds off of your best lap time, you probably need to push a little bit harder. So you maybe need to take another couple laps. But the other thing is just an even more simple answer to that question is enough laps for you to be able to tell the difference. And a lot of times at a real racetrack, when I'm coaching drivers, I will tell a driver we just made a change, go out and see what that feels like and do as many laps as it takes to be able to feel what that change did to the car. And it may have made the car better. It may have made it worse. It may not have made any difference. And it's okay to come back in and say, I didn't feel any difference, because some changes you don't. Okay. Wow. There's a ton of information here to throw at you. Hope you're making notes. Obviously, things that you can work with are, we got tires, we got spring rates, we got anti-roll bars, we've got dampers or shock absorbers. We have ride height and rake. And just to make sure that everyone's on the same page here, I got to reach across here and grab my, sorry, I don't have a Porsche here today. So ride height, if we lower the ride height, that's this, right? That's lowering the ride height. More rake is this. Less rake is this. And that can be a very powerful tuning tool, is changing the rake of the car. We can change camber. Hopefully you guys have all did your high school automotive class and you know that camber. Let me get this so it's a little bit maybe easier to see. I'm going to twist these wheels and they're like that. So that is more negative camber. This is positive camber. Rarely do we use positive camber except on the left-hand side of a car that's on an oval track. So we can do that. We can change toe. So the front tires either towed out or towed in. We can also do that on the rear. Rarely do we ever want toe out on the rear of a car. And the reason for that is if you turn in, first of all, when you're braking, the car is going to be wanting to do this because the rear tires are trying to do this. And it's very nervous, unsettling. It scares drivers, even if it's a simulated scare. And so practically all the time we run toe in on the rear tires. There's a rare exception, but we're not going to get into that. But the front, we can run toe in, we can run toe out, we can run pretty close to straight on. So we can do that. We can adjust aero for some cars, and aero can be a rear wing. It can be the front dive plane or splitter on the front, the size of that. And again, rake has a big impact on aerodynamic downforce for certain cars. And without going way too deep into this area, we can, if we want to have the car get down the straightaway faster, we want less wing in the car. We want less downforce because there'd be less drag then. Sometimes what we do is we actually lower the rear of the car, and that takes that wing out of the airflow. And then when we brake, because the car dives like this, we get some of that back. But that's let's see how far we go with aero tonight. Okay. And there are things like, we can change the differential, we can change caster, we can get into some cars, have a third spring in the suspension. There's a whole bunch of other areas, but the areas that we've just talked about are pretty much sort of the most common things that we cover. And if we stick to those, we're probably going to be okay, because if we go too far off from those, we're probably going to get ourselves in trouble. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I'm actually going to talk through some examples, and these are part of my goal here is to give you some real practical, hey, my car's doing this, what would I do? And so I'm going to just talk through things, and I'm going to basically go through corner entry understeer, mid corner understeer, exit of the corner understeer. And then we'll go to corner entry oversteer, mid corner oversteer, or corner exit oversteer. And we'll just kind of talk through what changes you can make and why. And that's, to me, the most important part of this is that you start to understand the why and you start to understand the thinking behind that. So let's start with corner entry understeer. Let me park some cars in the paddock. And this car is going to come into the corner, going to go through the corner this way, and is going to get some understeer. The driver wants the car to do this, but the car kind of plows or understeers like this. And it's in that first third of the corner. We kind of break the corner into corner entry, middle of the corner, and corner exit. So the car is understeering in the entry of the corner. Think about why that might be. And if somebody wants to throw some ideas in here, feel free to chat area. But the biggest thing here is probably what we want the car to be a little more responsive on initial turn in. So as we're coming into this corner, we want to turn and we want the car to go where we want. So we need the car to be a little bit more responsive in the way it works. If we worked our way through this thing, car's doing it in this corner, where in that corner, in the first part of it. What am I doing? And this is where it's important to start to really think about that. What am I doing? So as you're coming into this corner here, as you turn the corner, are you turning the steering wheel, just turning in, and then the car immediately starts to understeer? Or have you turned in, and then it starts to give up. So that's one thing, is just starting to understand that. And then the next step is, what are you doing with the brakes? Have you come completely off the brakes? Are you trailing in? Are you slowly coming off the brakes as the car understeers? Because we tend to think, and what we've been taught all through any kind of education around high performance driving is to help the car turn. We want to keep the weight on the front end of the car, right? We want to keep the car loaded up on the front end. And to do that, we trail in more. We keep our foot on the brake and we keep the car loaded on the front end. But there's two different ways that we can get understeer here. One is we can pop our foot off the brakes, turn the steering wheel, and the car is the front end's unloaded and it understeers. Or we can be so hard on the brakes as we're turning in, we're asking the front tires to turn and brake at the same time. So we've overloaded them and we've asked too much of them and they give up. So that's why it's important that you ask this question and understand, what am I doing at that moment in time? So let's just pretend here that we turned into the corner and we turn in, and then the car starts to understeer and you're releasing the brakes. You're just sort of slowly coming off, but the understeer begins before you actually finish coming completely off the brakes, before the end of braking point. Things that you could do, we could increase the front dampers. We could take the front dampers or shock absorbers, and we could increase the front low speed compression. And what that's going to do is it's going to help you can think about it as two ways. It's almost like it's going to push more load onto those front tires as we're coming into the corner. Okay. So we could do that. We could increase the rebound. And what that does is, rebound in the shock absorber or damper is, we compress the spring, and then as we unload it, it wants to expand again. Well, with more rebound in the dampers, that's going to slow that down. It's like it's dampening that movement. So if we increase the rebound as we brake and the front end squats or dives down, and as we come off the brakes, the front end is, even if we take our foot off the brakes quickly, the front end is going to go and slowly come up because we're holding it down with more rebound. So that could help. We could increase the front toe out. So rather than the tires being at, a millimeter of toe out, or 2 millimeters of toe out, or a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch or something, whatever it is, of toe out, we could actually take them out and just move them out just a little bit more. What that tends to do is, as you come to the corner, you think about it, if the front tires are kind of pointing on that angle coming to the corner and you turn, this inside tire is really wants to pull the car into the corner. So it's going to help turn it in that way. Now, what is the downside of more toe in or toe out? Either one of those. Scrub going down the straightaway. It can actually slow the car down. You wouldn't think it would, a millimeter or more, millimeter or two of more toe out, you wouldn't think it would make much difference, but it will. It will actually cause more scrub. We could lower the front of the car, and what that does is it typically lowers essentially the center of gravity in the front of the car, gets the car down lower, and that helps it. We can go too far with that and we get into bottoming, or sometimes the suspension geometry isn't designed to be that low, so we can go too low in some cars. But most times, lowering the front of the car will help the car turn in a little bit on corner entry. And ultimately, what you're doing is you're increasing rake. So that's some things that we could do with corner entry understeer. And yes, there are more, but those would be the if we walk through all this stuff and you told me those things that I just went through, I would say, okay, we could tune that with the dampers by increasing the compression and or the rebound. We could, in order here, I said we could increase the toe out, we could lower the front ride height and increase the rake. So all of those things are going to help. Those would be sort of my first round of things that I would do to the car. Okay, so then now let's say that we've come through here. The car is turned in okay, but right in the middle of the corner, the car now starts to understeer. Again, think about what are you doing at that moment in time? Are you turning the wheel more? Are you starting to unwind? Are you holding the wheel? Are you kind of in that steady state area of the corner at that point in time? And when a car is in a steady state kind of situation where you're not decelerating, you're not accelerating, you're not turning, you're not unwinding the steering wheel, not lessening the turn, the car is in this steady state kind of set. Or sometimes people say the car has taken a set. And at that moment in time, you could basically take the dampers, the shock absorbers, and take them off the car. They don't have anything to do with anything. The dampers work when there is change in motion, it's a dynamic thing. When the car is pretty much in a steady state or the car has taken a set, then it's the springs and anti-roll bars that are really making the difference at that point. So if the car understeers here, very first thing I go is soften the front anti-roll bar or soften the front springs. Again, we're trying to reduce the amount of load transfer across the front axle of the car. So that'd be the very first things. You would probably want to look at camber. So our camber, we could increase it, put more negative camber in. I know that's kind of, we always talk about it as put more camber in it. Well, that's actually less camber, more negative camber. So, but that's just the language that is used. So we could put more negative camber in, and sometimes that will help. It may be that you've gone too far and actually standing the tires up a little bit more, getting them a little bit more upright is going to help. And, again, the goal is to keep that outside tire as flat on the surface as possible. And obviously as it rolls, it's going to be going into kind of this positive thing. But if you already start off with negative camber, hopefully you can see some of that, it's going to help gain grip that way. So you could do that. Again, more rake would help. So let's now go to, coming through the corner and we're getting back to power now. We're on power and now the car starts to plow or understeer off the corner exit understeer. And if you think about what's going on at that moment in time, you are going around this corner and you're accelerating. So the back end of the car is squatting down and it's unloading the front end of the car. So as we're going around there, what you might want to do is do some things that are going to help kind of support the rear of the car and keep the car's weight, some of the weight on the front of the car. You can do that by increasing the rear dampers compression or bump. So if you add more back here, it's kind of like adding a little bit stiffer spring, but again, we're in a dynamic situation where things are changing. So the dampers are going to help. So it's going to help support the rear of the car. You can actually put more rebound in, which is going to help hold the inside down a little bit more. You could reduce the rebound, take some rebound out of the front dampers, which is going to kind of allow the front tires to, as the front of the car lifts, it's going to allow these tires to kind of drop more rather than, exaggerate. Sometimes you got to think about it as exaggerate to the extreme. The extreme would be you get in the power and you pop a wheelie, right? And what we want is those front tires to droop down and stay on the road. So if we reduce the rebound, they'll stay down there. So we could try reducing that front rebound. We could also try again softer front springs or anti-roll bar in the front would also help on the corner exit as well. And again, more rake because you're trying to get more of the load on the front end of the car there. Okay, so now we've gone through and we've looked at understeer all the way through those corners. Let's now look at oversteer. Coming into the corner, you come into the corner and you turn in and the back end wants to come around immediately. So what do we need to do here? First reaction is, let's get some weight back there, right? We want to get some load on those rear tires. In the order that I wrote them down, this is a situation where maybe what we want to do is we want to decrease the rake. We actually want to lower the rear of the car. What we could also do is we could we could, let's see here, increase. Yes. So understand what I'm going through right now is I like to try to think of myself as the shock absorber, as a damper, and which way do I want to go here? So we're coming into this corner, and the back end's coming around. So I'm trying to get some more grip back here. Which damper can I do some work with? And if I increase the front rebound, it's going to hold the front end down a little longer, and it's going to, or sorry, I mean, I want to decrease that. So as I turn into the corner, I'm going to kind of soften the front end of the car, which ends up giving the front a little bit more grip as we go through there. I might actually pretty high on my list of things to do. Priority is I would soften the rear anti-roll bar, because I want to try to get the car to have some more rear grip. Again, I'm trying to reduce the load transfer in the rear. Softer rear springs would help as well. Sometimes in the corner entry though, because I like to think about, can I tune the car on the entry and the exit with the dampers and the springs and the anti-roll bars through the middle of the corner? That's how kind of the priority list that I go through. And a lot of times you can't, but if you can, that's a good way to kind of think about it. Okay, so we've gone through the lower the rear of the car, take some rake out of it, decrease the front rebound, soften the rear anti-roll bar or rear springs, decrease front toe out. So like I said earlier on, by putting more toe out in, it's going to help reduce the understeer, but so taking it out is actually going to help make the car not be quite so responsive on turn-in, because in some ways what we want is we don't want the car to be quite so responsive on turn-in. Now, there are some other things we can do here in terms of brake bias. And, well, I'll just quickly go here. We could try reducing the front or reducing the rear brake bias a little bit. So right now, let's say your car has, and some cars you can't adjust it, some cars you can, but let's say your brake bias is set at 56% on the front brake bias or front brakes and 44% on the rear. You might try going to 57 on the front and 43 on the rear. And that just makes it so that as you turn in, there isn't quite so much of the rear brake still braking and trying to make the car kind of skid or lock up a little bit in the rear as you go into the corner. Okay, so you come through the corner and now we get some oversteer in the middle of the corner. Again, at this point, I'm going to kind of say shock absorbers, dampers, I'm going to put you aside here. I'm not going to work on you because the car is kind of taking a set here. And all I'm going to work with here is softer rear springs or softer rear anti-roll bars. Could lower the rear ride height, lower that to help that. We could look at if we've got a car that we can adjust camber. Again, we could play with the camber on the rear as well. And those are places where, those are the first things that I would go to there. And obviously we're not even touching on aero here. Where are we here? I wanted to go to, so we're at power oversteer. This is the classic on power, and the car is like this. Not quite drifting out of the corner, but we're getting some, we're not getting our power, we're not able to put the power down coming out of the corner because the car wants to snap sideways coming out of the corner. Again, soften the rear springs, soften the rear springs here, soften the rear anti-roll bar. We might be able to fix some of it with the dampers by, again, we could soften the rear compression or bump, because sometimes it's called compression, sometimes it's called bump. But we can soften that. We could soften the rear rebound, because again, that's going to kind of allow that inside tire to stay planted on the road as we're coming out of there. We could also, again, this is kind of one of those things, we could actually increase the dampening in the front of the car. And it's not necessarily, this is not a case of, like I said earlier, we're trying to give the rear more grip. So and we can't do that. Let's go take some grip away from the front. It's not really what we're trying to do. There is something called roll couple, and it's basically the balance between how much roll or load transfer there is from the front to the rear. And by stiffening the front, the rear is going to be sort of connected a little bit more. So sometimes by increasing the front stiffness on the dampers on the corner exit helps that as well. Okay. Wow. Just threw a lot at you. Did any of it stick? Okay. So the key to this is think about what's going on with the car, and then think about what are the tools that you have to fix what it is you need to fix. Again, if you've got understeer, you're trying to put more grip on the front. How can you do that? Well, it depends on where you are in the corner. It could be with softer front springs or anti-roll bar or dampers. If you're trying to give more grip to the rear, the first step would be to soften the rear springs, anti-roll bars, or dampers. That's kind of like the general thing. Soften the end of the car that needs more grip. So, and that works primarily in any of the phases, the entry, the mid, or the exit. However, think about if you're going to put priorities on the tools that you're going to use, what settings you're going to adjust. I would, if it's the middle of the corner, springs and anti-roll bars. If it's entry, then you can start thinking more about, or the exit, you can start thinking more about also tuning it with the dampers as well. Okay, so kind of as an overall guideline there. Oh, and understeer, lower the front. Oversteer, lower the rear, and that can have pretty big impact. I think you all know that from an aerodynamic perspective, the more aero downforce you put on the rear of the car, you're going to get more rear grip, and more on the front, you're going to get more front grip. One of the other questions that you're going to want to ask yourself, though, is, if it's, what is the car doing where, what corner? Sort of a little sub thing from this question is that a low speed corner, or is it a high speed corner, or a medium speed corner? If it's a low speed corner, trying to fix it with wings and aerodynamics probably would not be the highest priority. Not saying that wings don't work at, even 40, 50 miles an hour. They do, just not very much. If it's a 100-mile-an-hour corner, though, that might be the very first thing you're going to work with, is the aero side of things. So when you ask which corner it is, also ask, is it a low-speed corner? And people go, well, what's low speed and what's high speed? It depends a little bit on the car, but in that 60 to 70 mile an hour range, if it's below 60, that's kind of a low speed corner. If it's 50, that's definitely a low speed. If it's 60, 65, that might be like a medium speed corner. 70 and above, it starts to become a high speed corner. And so you can start to think about that as, the split of aero for most cars. And again, prototype cars and Formula One and Indy cars, they generate a lot of downforce even at 50 miles an hour. But a GT3 won't generate a lot of aerodynamic downforce at less than 60, but over 60 it starts generating more. So just sort of keep those guidelines in mind as well. Okay, I know I threw a lot at you there. I hope you were taking some notes, and if not, well, let me see if I can answer a few questions as we go through here now. So so if you have questions, put them in here now, and put them in the Q&A section right now. Robin will keep track of them, hand them off to me. So I'm just going to kind of work through and try to answer as many of the questions as I can here. And I guess there will be some kind of a point where, if it's 1 o'clock in the morning, we will stop. Okay, Nick asked, what do you do to adapt to different race weather when your setup was tuned to another track condition, if you only had limited time before the race? Okay, so actually there's a conversation we had at a racetrack just a couple weeks ago. And It depends on the length of the race, and it also depends on whether there's any chance of it changing during the race. If you're going into an endurance race and it starts raining at the beginning, it's tempting to put on a rain setup on the car, which would typically be softening everything in the car as much as you can. And, that would be the kind of thing. But if there's any chance that it's going to dry out, whatever you gain from going to that rain setup in the rain, most likely will get overweighed by what you're going to lose when it dries out. So, again, it depends on how long the race is going to be and how able you are to predict it. I think in sim racing, it's a little bit easier to predict it, I think. Depends on who's running the event. What I can tell you is years and years ago when I was racing Formula Ford in my local racetrack, and we would get rain quite often at the local racetrack that was Westwood. We called it Wetwood because it rained a lot there. And often you would walk around the pits and you would see cars up on stands, and on one side there'd be 2 slicks, dry tires, and rain tires on the other side. And the reason is that because at the very last second, when you don't have a lot of time, that way you only had to change 2 tires. If you had to make a change of going to rain tires, you only took the slicks off and put 2 on. You didn't have to change all 4. So a lot of people used to do that. Okay, Brendan asked, how would one know which end of the car needs change? Like, how would I know the rear is understeering and not the front? Well, first of all, the rear doesn't ever understeer. The rear oversteers, right? So just and that's important. That's important, Brendan, just to get the language correct, because you can fool yourself, or not fool yourself, but confuse yourself by using the wrong words. And I've had lots of drivers say, well, the front just feels loose. Okay, let me just go through sort of definitions here a little bit. Understeer is we turn the steering wheel. I want to go through this corner over here. I turn the steering wheel like this, and the car plows straight ahead. It pushes, it understeers. It hasn't steered as much as I want it to. Oversteer is I want to go through this corner over here. I turn in, and the car does this. It is oversteered. It is steered more than I want to. The phrases that also get used, the car is loose. In NASCAR and IndyCar and oval track racing, you hear drivers say the car is loose or the car is pushing. So that's important that we get that clarified first. I think your question, though, Brandon, is really more around well, how do I know? Like, how do I sense that, right? And so I talked earlier about at some point you're going to drive the car fast enough for the car to show its weakness. And at some point, the weakness is the car is either going to push or plow or understeer straight ahead, or you're going to turn in and the back end of the car is going to come around and it's going to oversteer. And it may be just really subtle, so you hardly feel it. Well, at some point, you kind of just ask yourself, if I went 5 miles an hour faster through that corner, which end of the car would go off the track first? And it's just kind of a good way to a mental image of what it is that's going to happen. When you ask yourself that question of, if I went through that corner 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour faster, which end of the car would go off the track first? I'm coming into this corner here. I come in here and I turn in, and I'm not quite sure if it's understeer or oversteering. Well, if I went 5 miles an hour faster, would the car go off the track like this, like it's understeering off? Or would the back end come around and I'd spin like this? Okay, so ask yourself that question. That often kind of helps clarify your thinking on it. I'm just making sure, Brandon, I got you covered there. I hope I did. So Jared asked, speaking of LMP2 cars, are there any guidelines on the third spring settings? I said I wasn't going to cover third springs tonight, just because, wow, it's a massive, massive other topic of the clearances and stuff like that. And so the simple, so Jared, are there any guidelines? No. Let me just talk about this for a moment, just from an educational perspective. For some of you, you might I don't even know what a third spring does. cars have, typically they have 4 springs, one in each corner of the car, correct? Okay, we all kind of understand that all 4 tires have a spring on it, correct? As we go around a corner, think about that. As it goes around a corner, that, you know, the car leans, it compresses this outside spring, and it extends the inside spring. Okay, so that's what's happening when we go around this corner as it loads that outside tire. With cars that we're trying to keep the platform very flat and balanced for aerodynamic reasons, we want relatively soft springs so that the suspension will absorb bumps. But if we have them too soft, as I said earlier, you know, the car leans, and now the underside of the car is on it's on an angle. Or when we brake, we get the front end really compressing a lot, and we kind of close the nose off, the splitter to the ground gets closed off, and now no air is flowing underneath it, and you can actually get to the point where the air kind of stalls underneath it, and aerodynamically it loses downforce. So a third spring, what that does is it allows the outside springs to be relatively soft, and there's a third spring in the middle of the car that works through the push rods of the suspension, and under compression of braking, the third spring is the one that's going there, is working, and it could be stiffer, so it holds the front end of the car up as you're going around the corner. You can also have the third spring on the rear, and if you've got a lot of downforce in the car, as you're going down, as we get to a braking zone, or as you're going down the straightaway, the third spring is what's holding the rear of the car up. And that's what the third spring is meant to do, is to kind of help support the car and keep the car flat while still having relatively compliant, soft suspension. Like I said, it's a huge, huge topic that is a little beyond what we can cover tonight. Sam asked, where can you get info to understand what the change you made should have done to car performance? Where can you get info to understand what the change you made should have done to car performance? Okay, so Sim Racer Academy, we have a whole section in there in the library around all the car setup stuff. Also on my website on speedsecrets.com, I have an ebook. So if you go to speedsecrets.com, you go to resources, you go to ebooks, you will find a free ebook, how to tune your car's handling. And it goes through everything we've talked about tonight and a lot more. And it should answer that question, Sam. It should tell you that, okay, if I if I put in softer springs, that allows the car to roll more, but it actually means less load transfer. Same thing with a softer anti-roll bar, all those kinds of things. So hopefully that will answer that question. Nick asked, without manufacturer provided tire data, oh, I knew somebody was going to talk about tires too. I haven't really touched on that. What would you do to guesstimate the optimal slip angles of your tires for some given cornering load? The only guesstimate that I can give you is most radial tires seem to generate peak grip somewhere between 4 and 8 degrees of slip angle. Now, who cares? Really, I mean, in a way, unless you're doing some, engineering project. Sorry, Robin laughed at that or something. It almost doesn't matter what the numbers are. What matters is okay. Sorry, she won't stop laughing. So, anyways, Nick, I guess my point is the numbers don't really matter. What matters is, I guess, what you feel. And and if you went to Michelin or Bridgestone or name your favorite tire company, if you said, hey, could you give me that information? They won't give it to you. Tire manufacturers are extremely secretive of the information. In fact, I know tire engineers who work for those companies, and they have said, honestly have said, I don't know what those numbers are, because only certain people in the company know those kinds of things. So I'm not really sure what you would do with those numbers, even if you had them, unless I'm missing the point of the question. Oh, sorry. Anchor asked, at what point in my learning process does it make sense to start changing setups? Oh, great question. Great question. Let me think of the best way to answer this. So until you can drive a car consistently very close or at its limits, changing the setup on the car is you're wasting time. You would be better off spending that same amount of time working on your driving technique. So that's the very first part of that answer. The second part, I think, is you also need to get to the point where if you make a change, you're sensitive enough to feeling, noticing, and obviously in a sim, some sims have some motion, some don't. And it's a little bit harder sometimes to sense what some of these changes make. So, first of all, you got to be consistently quick and close to driving the car at its limits. And then secondly, you need to then have the sensitivity to be able to note, report, sense what the car is doing. If you make a change and you don't notice it, and then you make another change and you don't notice it, and you make another change and you don't notice it, I would say it's time to go back and put the baseline setup and just work on your driving and improve your driving to the point where now the car is showing its weakness. And I think that's a key point too, Anchor, is until the car starts to show its weakness, don't bother changing it. I know some people that get into making changes to the setup way, way too soon, and they would be much better off if they spent the time working on driving more and getting closer to the limits of the car than they would playing with the setup on the car. Bruce asks, what is the priority list on making changes? What should you change first, second, third, etc.? The very first one is change the thing that's going to help the most. How's that? Not much of a very good answer there, right, Bruce? So if I was at a real track and not a sim track, at a real track, the way I would answer that question is whatever is the easiest to make a change with. If you're at a track and at a real track, and the only tool you have is a tire pressure gauge, then tire pressures becomes the highest priorities. If you don't have a tire pressure gauge, but you do have a tool for adjusting the dampers, then that becomes the priority. If you don't have those tools, but you can change the anti-roll bars, then that becomes the highest priorities. So that becomes, at a real track, that's the way I would approach it. In the sim world, it's pretty much click, click, and you can make those changes. So you kind of take that part out of it. And then it becomes more a matter of I would think about it at first in terms of load transfer. And in the corner, so again, going back to if I want more front grip, I want to reduce load transfer. And I can do that with the dampers, with the springs, and with the anti-roll bars. And if it's early in the corner, very early in the corner, I would try to do it with the dampers. If it's a little bit later to the middle of the corner, I would do it with the anti-roll bar, and then I would go to the springs, because the anti-roll bar can be a kind of almost a fine tuning tool. So if it's like a big understeer, go to the springs. If it's just a little one, go with the anti-roll bar. And then if it's more towards the exit, again, I try to lean towards the dampers and then the anti-roll bar and then the springs. So hopefully that kind of helps with the priorities there. Will they get a link for the recording? Yes, I think I can do that. I'm always hesitant because technology. my hope is that this is all being recorded, and 99% of the time, one time it failed on me. So I'm always a little hesitant until the end to go, hey, it worked. But if so, Anchor helped Anchor Bergson, and thanks again, Anchor, because Anchor's kind of on my team with Sim Racer Academy as well, and obviously heavily involved with the PCA Sim Racing world and PCA. I will connect with Anchor after tomorrow, and as long as everything goes right, he can get a link out to you. Speaking of Anchor, he says, if you can cover rear wing settings, it will be great. Okay, let's cover them over. No. So, obviously it depends on the rear wing design. You know, whether you have one element, two element, maybe even three elements. And sometimes we also have a gurney flap. And let me draw a wing here. So there's a wing. This is me over here still. This is the air rushing towards the wing, and the air coming to the wing has a choice. It can either go this way or it can go this way. Which way is the longest distance? Longest distance, because air always likes to come back together like this. And as it comes back together, which one had to go the longest distance? Along the bottom here, which means the air was flowing faster underneath the wing, which generates a low pressure area. So that's a low pressure area. That's what generates downforce. People kind of think, well, it's the air hitting this and pushing it down. And there's a little bit of that. But what really makes a difference, yes, there's a high pressure area here pushing down on it, but it's this low pressure area underneath the wing that makes the biggest difference. Most wings, not all, but many wings also have a gurney flap, sometimes called a wicker bill. And that causes the air, let me use this one, causes the air to do this and actually speed that up just a little bit more. And again, there's a big negative pressure area right there. So the adjustments that we can make with the wing is the angle of attack. We can change the size of the gurney flap on the rear of the car, or on the rear of the wing. Most times, not all the time. So those are some of the things we can do. If we get into double and triple element things, I'm thinking that's a little beyond what I can cover. I'm working on my aero class, but that's the biggest thing. If you want more downforce, put more angle of attack, or put a larger gurney on the rear of the wing. That's the simple thing. If you want less, lower it. Put a smaller one on there, or take it off. So that's the simple thing. Understand that every single time we generate more downforce, we also generate more drag, and that slows us down the straightaway. The big question, I think a bigger question becomes, is the trade-off, because we do get more downforce, which allows us to go through corners faster, but then it slows us down the straightaway. Depending on the track, sometimes more downforce and more drag is a benefit. Some tracks, it's not a benefit. The simple examples would be Road America, big long straightaways. A lot of people think that you're better off lowering the rear wing, and for some cars, that is the right way to go. I will tell you that in a prototype car and Indy cars, you actually run more downforce than you would ever think, because Road America also has some big, long, fast corners. And if you can get through those really well, that helps you. But then you can also get into a situation where, okay, more downforce helps you for qualifying to turn a faster lap. But in the race, you take a little bit of downforce off, because where is it easier to pass? In the corners or on the straightaway? I would rather have less downforce so I can rocket down the straightaway, pass all of you, get in the corner, and even if I'm like skating around through the corner and struggling to get through the corner, you're all behind me. You're probably stacked up behind me, all getting frustrated with me. We get on the straightaway and I drive away from you again. So there's a big strategy around using that. Yeah, okay. So I know that you use that wing on the Porsches, and I can't remember the amount of adjustments you have. Anyways, I think I covered the basics of that. The biggest things I think about is your job is to think about, is more downforce and more drag an overall benefit, or is it actually, am I better off having less downforce and less drag, and I'll get around the track faster? And again, for qualifying, you might want more downforce. For the race, you might want less downforce. Okay, so Bruce asked, so mid-corner, focus on springs and anti-roll bar? Yes, I mean, that's my first place to go. In terms of the priorities you asked about, yes, I would go mid-corner. I would look to springs and anti-roll bars first. And again, if it's a big understeer or a big oversteer, look at springs. If it's a little one, tune it with the anti-roll bar first. And then if it's a big one and you make a change with the springs, then you can maybe fine tune it with the anti-roll bar. Bruce, well, I don't know if it's the same Bruce, but Bruce asked, entry and exit corner, sorry, focus on what parts? Entry and exit corner, focus on what part? Okay, so maybe this is related to that. On the entry and exit of a corner, then often my priority switches from springs and anti-roll bars to dampers, shock absorbers. Again, dampers is the correct term, but in North America, a lot of people tend to call them shock absorbers. They don't absorb shocks, but they do dampen motion, and that's why they're called dampers. So on corner entry and corner exit, I like to go to dampers first. And again, the reason for that is dampers only really work when there's some change, and they are speed or velocity dependent. Not velocity of the car traveling down the track, but the velocity of the movement of the damper and spring. And so it's more important that way. Springs and anti-roll bars are displacement or distance dependent. So again, that would be that we'll cover that in part 2 of this, okay? But as a simple thing, if the car is doing something that I want to change in the corner entry or towards the very exit of the corner, I'm thinking a little bit more about the dampers than I am about the springs and shocks. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't change the springs and anti-roll bars. I'm not saying I wouldn't change those, but I would lean towards the dampers first. If I can tune it with the dampers first, great. If I need a bigger change, then I go to the springs or the anti-roll bar, then the springs. Jeffrey, great question. How do you tell if you should change the setup or your driving? So part of it depends on how much time you have, and actually part of it depends on what you're most interested in. I would always, me personally, I would always rather fix something with my driving, and the reason is that I learned something about my driving in doing that. Now, I like tuning a car. That's really fun, and I love the understanding of the why all these changes make a difference. But I lean towards the driving, so I am biased. I admit it. I'm a driving geek, and so I would always lean towards that. But I also always go to this question of, is it me or the car? And maybe that's kind of what you're asking here, really, Jeffrey, is how do I know if it's me or the car? If the example that I used at the very beginning was the car comes into the corner, I turn into the corner, and the car just kind of plows straight ahead and understeers, it doesn't change direction the way I want. If I try trail braking more, I try trail braking less, I try turning in a little quicker, I try turning in a little more gently, I try those 4 things, and the car does it every single time, that's the car. If I can make a change with my trail braking or my steering movement, then I'm going to continue to work at that. So I think the biggest, maybe the main part of this question, other than me having a bias towards always fixing things with your driving, is try different things with your driving. If it has an impact on things, then more leaning towards fix it with your driving. If it doesn't have anything, you can't fix it with your driving, then you got to fix it with the setup. Daniel asks, taking notes sounds easy, but this quickly becomes multi-dimensional. Do you have any recommended formats for taking notes? Oh, Daniel, you know, I've seen, I think somewhere between a gazillion and 4 kabillion different forms that people have created. And no, I honestly, so do I have any? No, I don't. Have I used different ones through the year? Yes, I have through the years. And, you know, I was just at a track with working with a new engineer a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, it's always interesting to see how engineers work. And this engineer, all he did was he had his list of lap times. And at the end of it, he'd ask the driver, what's the car doing? And all he'd do is just take notes of what the driver was saying. And there's no fancy form. There was no nothing. And I was like, oh, okay. So this engineer is the same as the previous engineer and the previous engineer before that. Most of the best race engineers just listen to what the driver says, write it down. And if they are not able to come up with an answer from that, they ask the driver more questions. And I think, you know, you in this situation are probably going to be the driver and the engineer. And that's when you're wearing both hats. And, you know, while you're on the track, you're the driver. But as you come off the track and you stop and then you go, what's the car doing? What corner? Where in the corner? What am I doing? Is it me or the car? And then if I could have it do one thing better, what would that be? And if you ask yourself that question, you pretend that there's your race engineer sitting there asking you these questions. And then every single time you answer it, the engineer might say, yeah, well, tell me more about that. And the more you can answer that, the more you dig down into it, the easier it becomes. And I think a lot of some of you are probably going, wow, you just threw a whole bunch of stuff at me. How do I do that? The more you break it down and the more you understand and kind of go, well, the car just doesn't respond when I turn in the corner. Okay, I can change the dampers. I can change the anti-roll bar. I can change the springs. I can change the brake. Let's just change those. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with experimenting with it. The absolute best thing in my opinion about sim racing is you can go and practice and you can try a bunch of different things and it doesn't cost anything. Man, how many years I raced in real cars that, you know, I couldn't afford to go testing. In a sim, I can go in there and go, I wonder what would happen if I raise the rear ride height, 3 millimeters. Well, let me go and find out. So don't be afraid to try things. Ivan asked, is there a good resource to estimate ideal pressures? I'm assuming tire pressures you're talking about, apart from running the car at different pressures and comparing lap times, i.e. Pirelli recommends 27.5 to 28 in a GT3 for ACC. Is there a good resource? Not particularly. So with Sim Racer Academy, I'm going to be adding a lot more content about tires in the next few months on my my real world Speed Secrets world. I just back in October, did a webinar on tires with an engineer friend in the UK. And it's one of those, tires is one of the most challenging components because there's a sweet spot, and you're saying Pirelli recommends 27.5 to 28 psi. Great, start there. And then what I would do is I would start to do these sweeps. I would go practice, and again, because you can practice in a sim anytime, and it doesn't really cost you anything, then other than if you're staying home from work and doing it, okay. But you can go and go, well, let me try 29 psi. Let me try 26 psi. And then start kind of narrowing it in and trying to find that. And what I will tell you is in both the sim world and the real world, I have seen two drivers who are equally as good and who can turn the equal lap times, and they'll run their tires 2 psi different from one driver to the other. And it comes down to, a more tire pressure. When you come into the corner and you turn in, the car is more responsive because the sidewalls don't flex as much. So the car feels very responsive, but it might not have as much overall grip. Another driver might go, I'll give up that responsiveness, but I just want that more overall grip. And the driver is using those tires in different ways. So it does come down a little bit to how you drive and what you like the feeling of. So the biggest thing I'd say is start with what the recommended is, but don't be afraid to, like I said, try 3 PSI or 4 PSI either direction, and then come back to 3 on either side, then 2 on either side, then 1 on either side. And then really pay attention to what do you feel? And you may just go, when I'm heading in this direction, like a little bit more pressure or a little bit less pressure, I like that feeling. Okay, I guess last question, Graham. And perfect timing. We're going to go for an hour and a half. Perfect. Graham asked, does your sim program focus more on driving better or more on advanced racecraft? Yes. The one thing I'll say is it is easier to teach driving technique and even car setup and everything else. Racecraft, I can give you the principles, I can give you the ideas, I can give you the mental mindset even around racecraft, but then it comes down to doing it. And one of the things that we're doing, actually, we're starting day after tomorrow on Saturday, we're starting a regular every weekend, a practice race, and then the following weekend it's a race. And it's a practice at a certain track in a certain car, and then the following week it's a race there. And they're all practice races. So we're kind of taking the approach of these are learning opportunities. And one of the things that I'll be doing on Saturday morning when we're doing this is I'm going to be observing, and I'm not going to participate, but I'm going to be observing and popping in because I can do this in iRacing. One of the great things about sim racing is I can pop around and watch what some of the drivers are doing and be able to kind of go, hey, Graham, how you set up that last pass, you might have thought about it differently. Next time think about, trying to time the pass on the exit of the quarter. So a lot of racecraft stuff is going to be more in the moment and experiential. And one of the things that starting to create more of now is content around here's an example or sample of here's what happened in a racecraft situation. Here's what I would have recommended the driver or drivers did or do. So there can be more of that. So Graham, yes. The idea, we have one simple goal with Sim Racer Academy to make you an even better sim racer. And obviously racing is a big part of that. So, okay, I think that's it. Everybody, thank you so much for letting me come and play cars with you guys. I love doing this stuff. Hopefully maybe we can get another chance to do this again in the future. And my goal now is everybody racing in this series, this league, is better, and they go and kick the butts of the people that weren't on this Chalktalk. So that's your goal, okay? So again, thank you for letting me come and play with you guys. Anchor for helping arrange all this stuff. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks to the PCA for letting me come and play. And I'm told that Porsche is going to ship me a new car, a new GT4, in return for doing this. Is that correct? Oh, wait a minute. No. Okay. Sorry. Anyways, darn. Hey, everybody. Thanks for being on here. Happy New Year, and keep learning and having fun, everybody.